Hey Scrabblers, get ready for another lesson. Today we'll be covering the fourth and final fundamental strategy in Scrabble, board management. Offense, defense, and leave all aim to increase your spread, which is of course the difference between your score and your opponent's score. A positive spread results in a win, and a negative spread results in a loss. Wins are important, but unlike chess, the magnitude of the win, or the spread, is also important. In some online rating systems, most notably the Internet Scrabble Club, which definitely has the highest density of expert tournament Scrabble players, actually take spread into account. And in tournaments, total spread breaks ties between players with the same win-loss record. In my last tournament, I lost out on $100 because of a poor spread. When I learned to play chess as a kid, it was generally a fly-by-the-seat-of-my-pants affair. I'd make a move to capture a piece, if not, make a move that would not see me immediately captured. I then realized that a lot of the skill in chess is the ability to think ahead, and to account for all the possible permutations of your and your opponent's moves, however many iterations into the future. Friends and I would argue who could think ahead more moves, and thus incorrectly label ourselves the better chess player. Scrabble is actually quite similar. The difference between the four fundamental strategies is when they affect your spread. The first strategy you learn, offense, is going to optimize your spread on your current turn. The second strategy you learn, defense, is going to optimize your spread on your opponent's next turn. And the third strategy you learn, leave, is going to optimize your spread on your next turn. It then follows, in the spirit of thinking ahead, that board management is the strategy that will see you optimize your spread over all subsequent turns. That is the topic of this video. The next video will make an amendment to leave valuation, and the following videos will be on tile tracking and subsequently the endgame. At that point, we'll have touched on all of the topics that we'll need to go over some full game evaluations in any adequate manner. I'll have some of those to follow. Board management is based largely on the structure of the board, and you should be able at this point to recognize a closed and an open board. A closed board often exhibits a lot of parallel plays, words that don't take hooks, and letters like C, V, and Q extending into open space. These all limit the availability of hotspots and make big plays difficult. Probably the most common way to close a board, and one that most novices will be familiar with, is the staircase. Now these are generated from a lot of parallel plays, and usually by two players who are at that level in word study where they've just learned most of the 2 make 3s. This can make a very small, dense board quickly closing off scoring opportunities. An open board is very low density, comprising many long intersecting plays, hookable words, and a plethora of hotspots and bingo lanes. Either player's ability to score well on this board is a lot higher than on a closed board. The most important part of this is that board structure will affect both you and your opponent similarly. Equity is a term that many experts use to quantify the value of a play based on offense, defense, and leave. It is meant to be a direct predictor of the magnitude of the spread. As you are trying to increase your spread, estimating, or let's face it, guessing equity, will give you an average indication of what the spread will be in the future. If you and your opponent are trading 25-point plays, it makes the spread in the future pretty predictable. But throw in the opportunity for big plays for either you or your opponent, and the spread becomes unpredictable. Many experts refer to this as entropy, or more descriptively, volatility. And if you remember back to high school math, it's analogous to the variance or the standard deviation of the spread. While equity is always a good thing, volatility can be very good or very bad depending on the game. Let's look at some graphs, because I love graphs. This is a game I played in my last tournament. It shows my spread throughout the game. I got 2 early bingos, one of which drew a challenge, giving me an early 150-point spread. We then started trading 25 to 30-point plays, and by the middle of the game, I still had my lead. At this point, we both want to maximize our own equity, but I want to decrease volatility while he wants to increase it. With low volatility, I can decrease the variability of the spread. Note the narrow bounds of the low volatility projection. This makes it hard for me to widen the spread in my favor, but more importantly, makes it harder for my opponent to narrow the spread in his favor. However, on average, the spread will not change due to a change in volatility. With high volatility, the bounds of the projection widen, with the lower bound sneaking beneath the zero spread line, giving him the real but slim opportunity to win. It also gives me the opportunity to double my lead. Now, if we look at how the game turned out, I managed to decrease the volatility by closing the board, sometimes sacrificing a little equity to keep the board in my favor. My only mistake was a poor phony, but the low volatility still ensured me a win. Should be apparent at this point that volatility greatly reflects the openness or the closedness of the board. Simply put, when trailing, open up the board, and when leading, close the board. Now you'll still need to balance your equity with your volatility, but accounting for this will make the spread more or less surmountable to your liking, and therefore increase your win percentage or chance of winning that game. So I'm going to end this video with an example, albeit a pretty long one. Let's jump into the game. Here's a board that I designed to try and give a good idea of how to use volatility to your advantage during a game. Now what you'll notice on the board is that it's pretty closed off. On the left side, there's not too many openings, a bunch of words that don't take hooks. You have chi there that really blocks off the top left quadrant of the board, and there's not too many hot spots or places to play at all in that section. Your opponent has just played Intruder, which has brought him to within 50 points of your score, but it's still a fairly large spread, and at this point you still want to prevent him from opening the board and getting even more spread. Of course, Intruder opened the board itself, so now what you're going to want to do is to shut that area back down. There's pretty much two plays here. The first is Aerial. It hits the triple word score, giving a decent amount of points, and allows you to dump a lot of the crap that you have on your rack, giving yourself a decent leave. However, when you do this, you keep one bingo lane open in column M, and you open up another one in column N. This gives your opponent two places that he can bingo to negate some of the spread that you've worked so hard to maintain. The other move is and while it's not as good offensively or as far as the leave goes, it's still the best when it comes to board management. And that's because it shuts down effectively all of the bingo lanes that had been opened up with Intruder, and the only possibility they have is to come down with the bingo in column O, hooking an H or an L onto the end of So let's commit to and we can see what now our opponent's rack is. Now if we switch our mindset to the opponent's, we can see that he now wants to open up the board. Quackle has the static simulation of his best play at nub, but of course that doesn't open up the board at all, and even though it gets rid of his B and the U, the two clunky tiles, and scores decently, it's definitely not the best play. Now you can play up from the X over here with either Adieu or Bow. While Adieu opens up the board a lot more than Bow does, it's just not good defensively. Your opponent can very easily take advantage of that A in row 1 and score big. And if you allow your opponent to score big just for the sake of opening up the board, sooner or later he's going to have such a lead in the spread that's going to be insurmountable even if you do bingo. So let's go with Bow. It's not as defensively suicidal, yet still opens up the board, giving you available bingo lanes through the B, E, and possibly even the A. So our opponent commits to Bow. Let's go back to our rack. So our first consideration on this board is going to be closing down the opening that our opponent has just made. After all, there's still a blank to be unseen, and that should make us a little bit more wary about giving him the opportunity to bingo, because it's more likely that an opening, a bingo lane, will be converted into a bingo if he does happen to have that blank on his rack. When it comes to equity, there's a pretty obvious play here, and that's Bowl, B-A-W-L. It does leave a bingo lane open technically, but a bingo in row 1 that ends in a B is highly unlikely. There's also some 9s that can be played through it, but that is also highly unlikely. It has a good leave, IES, pretty defensive, and offensively it scores for a lot of points, so we're going to go ahead and commit with that right now. So we'll go back to our opponent's rack. You'll see that, of course, he does still have the blank, and if we hadn't blocked off that opening that was made with Bow, then our opponent would have a number of bingos from idealism to sideline and a bunch of words I don't want to try pronouncing. So blocking off that opening with our last play was definitely our best move. So you'll be noticing a pattern here. He opens up the board, you shut down the board, it's a do-si-do, and by the end, if all of the plays you make are about the same, then the spread will end the game in about the same point that it started off this game, or in the middle game, at about 50 points in your favor. That's an ideal solution for you, really. However, it can also happen, especially if the spread's not too great, 50 points is not that big, that every time he opens the board, he's scoring a little bit more than you are. In that case, he can actually negate the spread without making that big play that you were trying to block, and you're going to have to reevaluate by the time that he gets a lot closer to where you are, and start working with a different strategy. So how can we open up the board here? There's a lot of places we can do it, and in pretty much every case, we'll be able to shut him down when it comes back to our turn. But there is one thing that you can do to try and make sure that your opponent can't close your opening, and that is making an opening in two different parts of the board, one aspect of forking, such that he'll close one down and you're going to leave one open for yourself. The best play in this situation, even though it's not very good in terms of equity, and if you run this through Quackle, it actually won't pick up this play at all, because even though it's good when it comes to board management and it forks and it gives you an excellent chance at winning this game, excellent being better than the 0% chance you had at first, Quackle won't realize that and will always present to you the solutions that have the highest equity, and then we'll go through those top 20 and can simulate all of those dynamically. But the play here is disable. That's because it opens up the bingo lanes off the D, and it also opens up the hook on disable of the D, R, and S. Now we go back to our rack. We've picked up a pile of crap, CVV, things that you generally don't want in your endgame because they're going to be really hard to get rid of, especially on a closed board like this. We have to block one of the bingo lanes, but of course we're going to be leaving one for him, which is never a good idea. So we have to assess which one is more likely. By playing Vive, here we close off both the bingo lanes in row 1 and 3 because there's no O's left in the game to make O'd, and even if there were, having the O as exactly the second last letter to access that row 1 bingo lane isn't that likely. Instead, we leave open the bingo lane in column M because there's actually no D's, R's, or S's in the pool that your opponent can have, only the blank. So in his rack, not only does he have to have the blank, but it has to form either a D, R, or S in the second spot. Not likely, but it's still more likely than you would wish when you have to give him this opportunity to bingo. So we'll commit to Vive, switch to our opponent, and what we see is that our opponent indeed does have that bingo prickle to play down column M exactly how he needed it and give him enough points to actually take the spread into his favor. Now with the unseen tile distribution, him having a bingo that he could play in this spot was pretty low, probably around 5 to 10%, but it's that 5 to 10% that gives him the option of winning and gives you the option of losing. He's not even going to think twice about prickle because he knows that's his only option of winning, and it's the best play no matter what state the game is in. Now, after your last play, you actually picked up a lot of high value tiles, and you have some great places to play them. Here you can play Fizz for almost 50 points. That more than gets rid of the tiny spread that he has on top of you and puts you 30 points ahead. But unfortunately, the game at this point is already lost. Even if you do make this awesome play of Fizz, you can see that your opponent has the N and the U, the only two tiles that are left in the unseen distribution. He can play these off for 15 points. You get stuck with a bunch of crap on your rack, and there's nothing you can do about it at this point. You play Fizz, which is still by far your best play, commit to it, but you'll see that once your opponent plays Pun, your opponent will go out, he'll get the points from your rack, and he'll end up winning this game by 2 points. A fortuitous win for your opponent, but these are the games that you need to make sure that you win because they are so easy to win if you just manage to keep the board closed. So where is our downfall in this game? Well, it was giving your opponent the opportunity to make an opening that you cannot close. In this case, it was playing Bowel. By playing any 6-letter word through A, B, or W, E, your opponent can create 2 places to play a bingo. And this is what you want to avoid. So even though Ball was a glorious play, equity-wise, let's take it off of the board. Instead, let's look at another play. Playing Web here doesn't score nearly as well as our previous play. It does leave you with a good bingo-friendly leave, but because we're trying to close all bingo opportunities, this isn't as good of a leave as if you were to keep the B and W, which are good tiles to block off the board, such as in this instance. The defense of it is not usually the best, but because there's no A's left in the game to play through the B, it's better than it could be. It doesn't look nearly as defensive as Bow, but what we'll find out is that it is. With the tiles left unseen, there's no way that your opponent can play through this to give himself 2 openings, and for that reason alone, it's the better play. Now, it's very hard to see something like this, but the more you have experience with board management, the more these things will pop out when you try and absolutely make sure your opponent has no way of winning this game by forking you and keeping 1 opening for himself. So let's commit to Webb and see what your opponent does. He doesn't have many options, and at this point there's nothing he can do to make 2 openings for himself, and so we're stuck in the same pattern. He lays down Ale here to try and give himself the S-hook, and you counter. He plays down Dino to try and open up some bingo lanes in column A and B, and you counter with Veld, making sure that there are no bingo lanes anymore. At this pace, we'll keep to the same do-si-do, and you should still win with that same 50 to 70 point spread that you started with, or more if your defensive plays can score better than his offensive plays, which is usually the case. Who knows, he may even open up a bingo lane that you can use yourself, giving you a huge spread and a definite win. So that's what we have for board management. It does get a lot more complex, and while it might be easier to understand now, when you get into games that aren't laid out like this, it's going to be a lot harder to evaluate than leave is, since you usually estimate the equity of leave in the game. For this, you have to plan in the future and make sure there's nothing your opponent can do. This gets a lot easier when you get to the end game and you know exactly what your opponent has on their rack, and that's why we'll be covering this in the next few videos. I really hope I've gotten some of you guys a lot more interested in Scrabble. Hopefully some of you have checked out your local club because of this. If you want to see if there is a club in your area, and there's hundreds of them in North America, you can go to crosstables.com. There's a link right here, and there will be a list of clubs and also a list of upcoming tournaments that you can play in if you think you're ready for that sort of thing. Also, I want to see a lot more comments down below these videos. Any sort of tricky situations or questionable scenarios that you've run into in your Scrabble games I'd like to hear about. I can probably give you some help on that, or if you don't understand what the hell I'm saying, hopefully I can try and make that clear. I also mentioned earlier the Internet Scrabble Club. This is probably my favorite place to play Scrabble if I want to play 1 game in 1 sitting, so it's quite different than Words with Friends or Facebook Scrabble where you just play 1 turn at a time. Games are timed and can be anywhere from really short to 45 minutes a person, and I'd recommend if you want to get deeper into that, you can play at the Internet Scrabble Club. Links right here. You do have to download a client to your computer, and it does seem a little bit shady, but all the experts use it, so it's pretty trustworthy. If you want to add me on the Internet Scrabble Club, my name there is Curran. You can always play me some games there. I'd love to have a game with you and hopefully show you some other tricks. And for now, happy Scrabbling and good luck on all your games.